the DAWbench Radio Show, the official podcast of DAWbench.com.
Welcome to the DAWbench Radio Show. I am your host, Vin Curigliano of AAVIM Technology in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm joined again by my co-host, Pete Brown of Microsoft in Maryland in the United States. How you going, Pete?
I'm doing really well, Vin. Thanks.
Awesome. Now, today, you're going to be doing double duty today, bud, because you're going to be wearing a second hat, and that's because you have a very heavy involvement in the MIDI 2 development, which we'll cover in more detail in context a little bit later. Now, before we get to that, though, we have two other special guests, and that is, in no particular order, Andrew Mee, who is a MIDI 2 consultant for Yamaha United States, an expert in the MIDI 2 subject matter, and author of an open source library for MIDI 2, as well as several articles for creating MIDI 2 devices, and also the author of the MIDI Workbench testing and certification tool. Welcome, Andrew.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me on.
You're most welcome, Andrew. And our second special guest is Gary Daniels, who's an engineer on the Microsoft Windows audio team, and among many other things, the architect of the Windows MIDI services and primary developer for the service driver communication and plugin architecture. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you.
Oh, you're most welcome, Gary. And also, I'm going to have to reintroduce you again, Pete, because apart from your job as an engineer in the Microsoft Windows development platform team, your other hat is also the creator of the Windows MIDI Services Project, client API and the applications, as well as Gary's counterpart for most of the feature development. And you're also chair of the MIDI Association Executive Board. Welcome again, Pete.
Why, thank you, Vin. It's great to be a guest on your show as well as a co-host.
Again. There you go.
Again.
Awesome. Now, look, we should do a little bit of background regards MIDI itself, the original development. And I'll just do this very, very quickly because the official launch of MIDI 1 was in January 1983 at NAMM, where they first connected that Prophet 600 and a Jupiter 6. Now, there was about 2 years development prior to that. Now, the lead drivers of that development were Dave Smith from Sequential and Taro Kakahashi from Roland. And there was, a few curves after the initial release, just getting people on board. Now, we went into great detail with that with Dave on his podcast. So anyone who wants to get a more detailed history of that whole development, and, there were some great stories being shared there, especially the initial naming of it. But, Dave went right into detail with that. So if anyone is really interested in getting a clearer idea of what was involved there, it'd be a good idea just to go back and have a listen to hearing it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, where Dave just covers that in great detail.
We were really lucky to have him on too, so he was such a great guest.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still saddened that Dave passed not long after we recorded that, Pete, as you know. I mean, it was less than a week.
Like a week later.
Yeah, a week later. But look, that's awesome. And if anyone hasn't heard that show before, that's just a fantastic show from start to finish. So I do recommend you go back and have a listen there. But for today, I think I'm going to hand it over to you, Pete, just to cover that initial history and the limitations that were imposed by the architecture of that time. And how it's actually developed and how we've got to this point now with MIDI 2. So, mate, I'm handing the steering wheel over to you, Pete. And who's that
That's dangerous, Vin.
Yeah, I know. Who's that cheering in the back, right? So I'm going to take a back seat on this one. There you go, Pete. All yours.
Thanks. And Andrew, folks, so, feel free to jump in here as I'm talking, especially if I screw up a detail. So MIDI, as you mentioned, 1.0 came out in 1983 as kind of a response to different ways of connecting the synthesizers and keyboards and stuff of the day together, to finally provide a way to do it in a cross-platform, cross-manufacturer way. And at the time, it was hardware to hardware. Like, computers were not really something that was considered in that first version. And so it was reliable but slow. And it had, everybody who thinks about the big 5-pin DIN connectors, that's where that came out of. It was just a serial protocol that ran at a relatively low speed, but sufficient for sending messages between these devices. Mm-hmm. And I think, one thing that people don't often realize is the protocol at the time, because, Vin, we talk about latency and stuff, and we talk about that kind of to death on audio. But on the MIDI side, MIDI 1.0, it takes about a full millisecond to send a note on message, right? So if you send like a chord of, say, 5 notes, then you're looking at like 5 milliseconds of time to send all those. And that's assuming nothing else is happening, right? So it's fine for the time, but I think a lot of folks are unaware of the amount of latency that's kind of built into that protocol to begin with. Yeah,
but, at the time, one of the points Dave made was that they were complaining about the speed of MIDI being so slow, and it was only because it was actually overwhelming the microprocessors of the time. It was actually too fast for the microprocessors. Yeah. Like
most people have watches that are way more powerful than anything that was available.
They'll probably have a pen. They'll probably have a pen now that's far more powerful. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it worked really well. Good for cross device communication, but still relatively slow. And then as computers started to get more into it, I don't know about other folks here, but I had so first, I had on my Commodore 128 at the time, I had a Passport MIDI interface that gave DIN connectors on the back of that.
Yep.
And then a little bit later, when I moved to the PC world, I had Roland MPU IPC, which was kind of an expensive card and box combination that still did DIN connectors, right, coming out of the PC. Mm-hmm. It required, custom drivers and all that kind of stuff to support that. And eventually, I think this was in the late 90s, the idea of doing MIDI over USB came out. And that was one of the first major updates to MIDI 1.0, is this new transport for being able to use it over USB 1.0 from computers.
Right.
And that, like I said, came, that's like, 18 years later or 16 years later, something like that. So it's, there's a good amount of time with not a whole lot going on. And then also since then, there have been additions like polyphonic expression, Bluetooth MIDI, a bunch of other things that have been added in there over time. And they kind of work with the original specification. They might extend it in sort of weird ways, like the way MPE works by using kind of a channel for each note and stuff. But folks were able to make it work.
Now, just real quickly, can you explain what MPE is? Is that MIDI polyphonic expression? Is that it, or have I got the terminology right?
Yeah, that's right. So for anybody who's used things like, I think the Rolly Seaboard uses this, and a bunch of other devices where you want to have different articulation for each note. Not just for velocity and not even just for aftertouch, but like really a lot more expressiveness there. There's an extension to the spec that allows that and enables that. And all those like super expressive controllers that are out there now are using MPE. And actually, I think there's some drum pad controllers that are using it, as well as like some other types of controllers.
Yeah. Was Roger Lynn involved?
Yeah. That's what I'm thinking of. Yeah. Yeah, so he's got that, and then it's also what generated a lot of, I'm going to say strange, they're non-traditional controllers for creating notes, right? It really extended a lot of that.
Alternate controllers.
Yeah, like when you see people like using weird big sticks with lots of buttons and stuff on them, like a lot of that came out.
Yeah,
of there.
like things like light harps and all of that type of stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so that added a lot of what people needed out of MIDI, but I don't want to say it's a hack, but it's kind of a hack, right?
Right.
And so we'll talk more about MIDI 2.0 here in a little bit, but MIDI 2.0 was designed to sort of unify all these things and make them more intentional as opposed to being like some way to shoehorn something into the existing protocol.
Right. Okay.
Andrew, anything to add to that? I'm sure I left stuff out.
No, I think that's a really good example of pre-MIDI 2, if you will. It seems to be that, MIDI was very much the concept that, in spite of its limitations, it was incredibly successful, and has been for the last 40 years a little bit too successful in a lot of ways, but certainly it was interesting to watch all these people try and do different things with MIDI that it was certainly not intended to do.
I flew a drone with MIDI on stage in Amsterdam at an event. Actually, it was kind of fun.
Well, I mean, I don't think when Dave and Taro initially brought this spec out in 1983 that I don't think they were expecting that 40 plus years later it'd still be so usable, with a few additions, but primarily it's still the core spec that they released in 83. Yeah, crazy.
And so that's the history leading up to MIDI 2.0. And I think maybe like Andrew, you're probably best positioned to answer this. Can you give us a little, like that was the background of MIDI 1.0. Like what does MIDI 2.0 do differently? And kind of what were the drivers for that? And also like there's one thing that I know that's very confusing out there, which is the branding of MIDI 2.0, where sometimes it means MIDI CI and sometimes it means UMP. Like, can you help sort some of that for us?
Yeah, I think the best way to look at this is in terms of the musician. We talk about a lot of the stuff in terms of, it's this technology, it's this name, but when you actually have to kind of describe it to people who actually have to use it, it's kind of best to break it down. So MIDI 2's been in development for a very long time under various names. I think some people may know of things like MIDI HD and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So the thing about MIDI 2 is it's a combination of probably 20 years worth of effort, really, because there was lots of different things that were always going to be, this is the new MIDI, and and for various reasons they didn't really get off the ground. So MIDI 2's come along, and it really is two different things. So one is what we call sort of discovery and auto configuration. So this is all the tools that really kind of help the musician work. And it won't be just musicians, but 90% of MIDI use is for that. So this is all the stuff that goes, oh, look, you're this kind of machine and I'm this kind of machine. We're the same kind of machine. Let's make sure we work the same way. And, we're talking to people the other day about simple things like drum mapping. You have one set of your V drums, which uses one set of notes and controllers for when you're drumming, and then something else will use a different set of notes and a different set of controllers. And you spend a huge amount of time trying to align these two things. So the whole point of one big part of MIDI 2 is to say, well, this is a pain. This is something that's very difficult for the musician to kind of do. It's not that it can't be done. It's just a pain to actually do it. So taking that and saying, well, how do we actually, make sure that those two things work together? And that's what we call MIDI CI, which is MIDI Capability Inquiry. And that's one part of MIDI 2. Where it gets confusing is that part will actually run on MIDI 1 because it's just SysX, it's existing SysX. But this sort of discovery allows for a couple of different things. So when we talk about, I was talking before about devices looking at each other and, they're the same kind of device. We call that profiles, and you can mix and match profiles depending on what your two devices are. So a couple of the profiles we've worked on just initially, because, we've had some of this has been in the works for a long time, is things like we've now just completed an MPE profile, which seems a bit backwards, but really what it's about is, there are things about MPE. When you plug in an MPE device, your computer doesn't know it's an MPE device unless you tell your computer that it's an MPE device that you've plugged in. So now you've got this ability to say, okay, I've got a device that's connected. What is it? Oh, it's an MPE device. I'm going to make sure I turn that mode on, right? And so, okay, you've turned it on, and now you've done it all. Now you can, for the musician, that's again getting back to this whole point where they don't really have to be thinking, oh, did I switch the MPE mode on? I'm pressing the keys, nothing's happening. And we're also looking at things like drawbar organ, for example. And what drawbar organ does is, again, making sure that the various key ranges are actually within a specification, that the sliders for the drawbars themselves are all uses the same set of commands in the same way. And then the other thing we're looking at recently has just come out. I mean, there's a few others that have come out as well, but one of the other ones we're looking at is things like orchestral articulation. Now, that's a little different because that goes into the second half of MIDI 2, which is UMP, right? So UMP stands for Universal MIDI Packet. So the old MIDI one used to have what we call a byte stream, a serial byte stream. And so, it's just like your old modems. It's the same thing. It's, a series of bytes, and, that you has the first byte is always got a high nibble, which means that the first little bit is set to 1, and all the other bytes are set, don't have that. So that's the start of the message, which is a really smart technique, but it also shoehorned us into having things that were a lot of the times only 7 bits in resolution. So this is this whole 127 steps, or technically 128 steps. So with UMP, it's almost based a little bit more on how USB works, in that we have these 32-bit words, and several 32-bit words will make up a universal MIDI packet message. And so now we have a lot more depth and data to play with. And so what we now have is this kind of concept where when we're hitting our keys on the keyboard, we don't have a velocity of 0 to 127 anymore. We have 16-bit. So was that 44,000 steps or something?
Slightly higher resolution.
much higher resolution. And I mean, these are all the things that musicians have asked for ages. I mean, we some people will say, well, I can't hear that difference between, on the velocity, which is, maybe your case. Although I have had people with some of the products that are actually out, I should say that they can swear black and blue that they can hear the difference. But when you start doing things like a filter sweep, and you're sweeping from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, you want that non-stepping kind of feel. You want that almost analog feel. To be honest with you, it's more analog than analog sometimes.
Oh, careful there.
I know. I'm sure there'll be someone out there who goes, no.
I think a few of their brains have already exploded and they're already typing away.
That's right. But a CC message, a standard control change message, is now 4.2 billion steps. And so, it's a massive amount of difference.
So how does that work with the expression map extension stuff that a lot of the orchestral guys have been using, or is that a different thing altogether? Well,
this is what I was sort of hinting at before. So orchestral articulation, the way that it works is on the note on message, because we've got this extra space, we can have extra details in it. So we can actually say, and I'm not an orchestral articulation person, so anyone out there who tells me I'm saying the completely wrong thing, I apologize now. But effectively what this specification does is it says, well, when I hit the note on, I'm going to give you extra details about how that note was actually played. So, for example, for a string section, for example, it might be, well, we're playing it, but the bow's up versus the bow being down. Or, other instruments might have a particular type of mute that's on it. And that's per note. So those kinds of things give us this ability to have extra expression that MIDI 1 itself could do or would do through, extra messages like Pete was saying through, certain messages for MPE or something along that lines. And certainly the DAWs already have.
But the important thing here, Andrew, sorry, I don't mean to say that all that's not important, but one of the important things I've heard about the orchestral profile is because we now have this stuff in the message, because that second word with the 4 billion possible values has been chunked up into different fields or whatever, that stays with that message the whole time, like in the DAW. So you don't have this disassociation with these articulation values being stored in one place, but the actual note information stored in another place, and potentially have them disassociated with each other.
Yeah, and I think that's where the expression maps come in. I should actually know a little bit more about them, but I know that they are very, very widely used with the film composers, and it's kind of an extension to what's available in regards to MIDI control of the note and how the notes are articulated, but it sounds like MIDI 2 is going to cover a lot of what is available in the expression maps in a standard protocol.
In a standard way, which is the important part of that, because now you don't have to worry about one orchestral plugin working one way and a different orchestral plugin working a completely different way.
Yeah.
Like you can swap the note information between them.
Yeah, and there's different styles of expression mapping depending on the DAW as well. So, So to formalize it, I think is going to be huge for that area of composition.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
So Andrew, you were talking about profiles, and then I don't want to cut that off, but then there's also the property exchange piece as well, right?
That's right. And the other thing with that, certainly what I've spent a lot of work on is property exchange. And the difference between profiles and property exchange is profiles is a common set of things, whereas property exchange is all about interrogating the device quite in-depthly to find out a lot more about it. So, for example, you can send what we call resources, and you say, well, okay, give me a list of your channels and what they're doing. And so you get this channel list resource and it says, oh, well, I've got, channel 1 is, got this particular patch on it, and channel 2 has got this, and channel 3 has got this. But from there, you actually can get further information like, well, what are the actual controllers available for this channel? So you look at channel 1, you go, oh, well, that's a synth. I pull up the channel, I can pull up the list of, controls. So this is everything from RPNs, NRPNs, control changes, all those things. And so from there, if you've got an application that can actually look at all this information, now what happens is, as opposed to having to, go and write, manually map for your particular controller, you actually pull in all those controller maps directly from the device. And it can be per patch, for example. So you can turn around and say, well, on this patch, it's this set of controllers, and on this patch, it's this set of controllers. So that's one set of things. I mean, even simple things like, what is your local on-off state, right? And the way that this works is it's all, and we're getting into the weeds here, it's JSON over sysx. And the reason we do it that way is A, because it's a fairly common format to process and parse. It's very, very quick. But it also means that you've got all of this kind of extra ability, which I don't think some of us actually considered, but some of the things that would be things like you could have help windows, for example, that connect to your device and automatically diagnose your device. The other thing too is being that it's all in JSON, it's very easy to parse for things like accessibility readers and stuff like that. So there's this concept that you've kind of democratized all the information that's coming out of the information. You don't have to be producing special sysx libraries just for one device. It's a commonality. So, we do tests where we have devices that have never been seen before by a particular application. You plug them in and the application tells you everything about that device, sets up a whole bunch of, channels and controllers and stuff like that. That's in there. The other thing that we have been working on is a thing called get and set device state, which allows you to come back to your session and say, well, I'm going to do a kind of like the way the plugins work is, okay, well, I want my hardware to come back to exactly the same state that it started in, or that I had this session in.
Yep.
Which again, these are all things that musicians have wanted. A lot of these things aren't particularly new. I mean, plugins have been doing this stuff for years. We don't even think about it. You start your session, you don't really go back to your plugin and say, oh, hang on, I've got to get back to that channel setup, and I've got to get back to that controller setup and that patch. The whole point of this is now it's again outside of the computer and outside of a particular DAW that you can actually start working with.
Right. And for the non-developers in the audience, JSON or JSON, depending upon which side of the earth you're on, it's just a it's just a text format. So it's JavaScript object notation. It's human readable. It's not like a bunch of obscure bytes or anything like that. Like, people could look at these messages and see what's happening.
Right. So it doesn't look like Egyptian hieroglyphics, is what you're saying.
Exactly. So Andrew, so just to kind of recap what you're saying, because I still feel like there's a bunch of confusion out there in the community. So you talked about MIDI CI, which is the stuff that can run over existing MIDI 1.0 transports today. So it can run over DIN cables if you have them connected in both directions, right?
Correct. There are some products out there that do that as well currently.
Yeah. It also can run over USB, and it's really just a matter of, do the devices have the firmware to implement those features? There's nothing, like, none of the operating systems have to do anything special. We can all do extra things to make it even easier, but this is something that if a manufacturer creates, and several have, a MIDI CI device that works over DIN today, or over USB today, it'll just work.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, a good example of that is all of Korg's new products that are coming out. They've got their new, ModWave 2, and they've got their key stage, and then they've also got all of their software as well, like their OP6 native and their WaveState native. And right now, you can connect the key stage to that, and it does uses MIDI CI, and it does all the things, and all of the controls appear on the key stage, and you've got that kind of immediate access. But it's open enough that there are other applications now that are actually using the same thing, and they work with the key stage. And so the key stage plugs in and sees this completely different application not done by Korg, and away it goes. It's all working as well.
So it's standard protocol stuff. It's all in the specifications for being able to do MIDI CI requests and responses. And then the second part was UMP. So if folks are looking to get additional resolution in controllers and whatnot, that's the part that is an entirely new kind of wire format, if you will, and a new protocol, and doesn't work over DIN, right?
That's correct. And also, we're looking, obviously at the moment, that's mainly USB, which I know you're going to talk about a bit in a minute. But also, I think one of the things I really want to highlight here is that it's all backwards compatible, right? So if you've got all your existing MIDI 1 setups, you're not throwing it away and going, oh, well, I can't use that anymore. So the whole point is that MIDI 2 is backwards compatible to MIDI 1.
Right. but the MIDI 1 devices don't get an increase in resolution or something because an operating system supports MIDI 2. That's like they need to go up that next level and implement UMP.
That's right.
Yeah. So I know there's a lot of confusion out there about this, so it's good to get that clear.
Yeah, I mean that's a kind of almost a given. I mean, if you're going to hook up an instrument from the 80s or the 90s with a MIDI 1 spec, you're not really going to expect it to be kind of understanding the higher resolution that MIDI 2 is offering. But as long as MIDI 1 is still working, then it's just, job done.
Yeah. And Vin, one of the interesting things that we're considering, not for the first release, I know we'll talk about the Windows stuff later, but I'll just throw this out there, is because JSON is just a text file, essentially, it's just text, we could create profiles or allow people to create their own profiles for like these older devices where we kind of intercept the request for getting that profile and we spit back the results that the user has provided so that they get like an additional benefit because there's an arbiter in between the device and the application.
Right. Okay. Now, is that going to open the floodgates to things being broken though, if it's that easily editable, or is it there's only just certain parameters that you can actually access via that text?
That's always the risk. So it's like, do you provide editors? Do the companies that create the devices provide them? Is there a repository at MIDI.org or elsewhere that has JSON files for classic devices? These are all things that need to be sorted a bit before that's implemented. But there are lots of options there.
Yeah, cool, very good.
So we talked a bit about that, and there are some other things, Andrew, I know that come along with MIDI 2.0 UMP. Can you talk a bit about some of the things that have been done for speed and jitter reduction and protocol negotiation, stuff like that? Yeah.
So a couple things. Let's talk about jitter reduction first. So one of the areas that's been added to the UMP specification is what's called JR timestamps, jitter reduction timestamps. So what that does is it provides a clock and a sort of a constant, it's like a preamble message that happens before you do your other messages. And so that way you can actually have it locked in and super steady timing on all your devices. And so it's kind of similar to how in application land you get a sort of a timing message when you have an incoming MIDI, so you know exactly when it was actually arrived. So it's a bit similar to that. And so this should sort of solve a lot of the sort of playback latency kind of, or not latency I should say, timing issues that people are actually sort of concerned about.
Yeah, and that one's interesting to me. Just to let people know that as far as I know, none of the operating systems are really implementing that yet, and none of the devices, but it's there for when it's needed. But I remember doing a test on Windows some years back where there's this mythos around the amount of jitter in MIDI, and when I measured it, it was actually well in the microsecond range for jitter there. So before folks jump on the jitter thing, I think it's important to know that maybe it wasn't as bad to begin with as people think, and they're actually running into the fact that it takes 5 milliseconds to send a 5-note chord, and if you're doing 16 channels of data at the same time, you do end up with jitter just kind of built into the old protocol.
I think the other thing that's probably a big improvement is the actual transports. So, I mean, one of the things is that USB being one thing, but certainly we don't have the speed limitations that were in the past. We were talking about that earlier with MIDI 1 being, 31.25, kilobits per second. We're talking now that, USB can be doing a lot faster. I mean, in the, the megabits per second and then some. And I think some of the early USB MIDI devices, they were locking down their speeds to match their DIN speed. So you'd have these devices that were sitting on, very high speed buses, all locked down to 31.25.
A lot still do.
Yeah. But, you know, the other thing we're looking at the moment is working in other transports. I mean, USB being one, but obviously, you know, network being the other, and actually trying to make sure we have a really good, you know, network spec that, you know, won't have these kinds of, you know, bandwidth bottlenecks that we've seen in the past. And I think that's another thing that, you know, we've come a long way in 40 years from having serial UARTs with optocouplers that couldn't, as you were talking about before, couldn't handle the actual incoming messages. You know, we're talking everyone's on gigabit networks now.
Yep. And even what you're saying about USB rings true, because the original USB MIDI specification was locked into USB 1.0 speeds, as I recall, at the time, where the new one is just, hey, you know, support the fastest speed that you can when it's connected, and you can negotiate by there. So having a MIDI 2.0 device over USB 3 is going to be much, there's a lot more speed and bandwidth there than most people are ever going to need.
Just on that, Pete, though, I mean, if you hook it up to a USB 2, you're not going to be disadvantaged, though, are you?
No.
So no, it'll be at max USB 2 speeds, right? As opposed to USB 3. But you know how it is, Vin. Like USB 3 can do real-time audio, and we're not anywhere near that level of data.
Right, yeah. Okay. So, but just on that, though, you know, even with audio interfaces, you know, with a good driver, USB 2 hasn't really been exhausted. And USB 3, where the advantage of USB 3 with the audio interfaces is more so with the number of channels availability, the availability of the number of channels that you can run across it, more so than the actual latency and speed of the device itself. So, I mean, we need to kind of just stipulate that you don't necessarily need to hook it into a USB 3 or USB-C to get the advantage of MIDI 2. That was the point that I was making. All right.
It's available for when folks need it. I hate to think, I hate to make statements like nobody will ever need speeds that fast, because that is always guaranteed to be wrong.
Well, who knows where we're going to be in 40 years, mate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got those black MIDI folks. They'll come after you and they'll challenge you now.
Yeah, great.
They were pinging me for a while on stuff. They're like, oh, it can't handle, or the old stack can't handle this notes. And I went to look at the notes, and this was years ago, and I first understood what black MIDI meant, and it was having so many notes on your piano roll that the screen is just black. That's where the term comes from. It's trying to max things out, and so even when we originally conceived this project, I made sure to put in a note at the time that is a non-goal for the stuff that we're doing. Like,
but it's not even musical, so what was the point of it?
Hey, don't try to define music.
Yeah.
Okay,
all right.
Well, it's also like the ones that, and I know I'm sidetracking here, but it's like the ones that were getting the pianos to talk. So they were actually sending so much MIDI data to actually make the pianos sound like voices and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, that's really fun. Not a goal for us, really.
No.
So, if it works, great.
It's like getting the engineers in the Formula One teams to kind of to program the ECU on the Formula One to sing a song. You know, with the revs. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but sorry, getting totally sidetracked now.
Probably not in the engine's design spec on that one. So
no.
So the other thing, so Andrew, thank you for that. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit here, and Gary's been really quiet because we haven't gone to you yet, but Gary's going to have a lot to say here in a little bit, is to talk about testing for MIDI 2.0, because I think a lot of people are interested in, what's out there for them to start with, like things like the workbench and hardware and stuff like that.
Yeah, so the difference with MIDI is MIDI 1, and let's be honest here, MIDI 1's a very simple, usually single direction kind of messaging. MIDI 2, all these features sound really great, and they are, because there's some of the stuff that's out there is fantastic, but it does take a little bit more to kind of think about what you've got to do, and to make sure that we don't have products out there that don't work as well as they could or whatever. one of the things that we've been a fair bit of work on is things that are testing tools and open source tools to actually help people develop the products. So one of the things that I work on is a thing called the MIDI Workbench, which Yamaha sponsors my work on. And effectively what it is it's a testing and development tool. You plug your device in or you plug your application in, and it does all these things that we've talked about. It interrogates those devices, makes sure that the messages that they do are correct, tells you where you're going wrong, and it also does a lot of the prototyping that we've been working on in the background. But that's the non-prototyping version of that is actually available to the public, and anyone can download that and install it. And the idea is that we also provide things like C++ libraries and other testing tools. Like one of the things that I've got at the moment is a USB descriptor builder, which helps people build their USB descriptors to make sure that they get them right, especially as the way that it works. The USB MIDI 2 has a fallback to USB MIDI 1, and so you've got to make sure you get all those descriptors correct. So we wanted to make sure that was as less painful as possible. But there's a lot of people out there who've been building some tools, and I don't want to, we've got people like Franz Dieter from Native Instruments, we've got Florian Boemers from Bonebox, we've got Benoit Boucher from Kissbox. Obviously, the Windows stuff is open source as well. And this is a really important thing within the actual community, within the MIDI Association members, is it's not all competition. It's like, no, you can't come and join. It's actually a little bit more involved. And one of the things that I tend to do a fair bit, I know Pete does this as well, but part of my role as the developer support working group chair is to actually reach out to people who are non-MIDI Association members to actually go and help them with their development.
Right.
And try and make sure that we have better MIDI 2 products in the market.
Yeah, and I remember early on you and I brought in, because the MIDI Association is a standards body and a trade association, and everybody in there who wants to participate needs to be mostly a corporate member. And we're like, how do we support Linux and open source? And we had lobbied to reach out to Takashi on the ALSA team and have him brought in as kind of a special member of the MIDI Association, even though there's technically no corporation behind that. And also why we, gave him access to the Microsoft repo early on and stuff as well, so that he could see that even before we had it public. And it's really nice to see things like that happening through the MIDI Association. The other thing that you were talking about, Andrew, is, I guess really along the same lines, is what's the way in the MIDI Association that these different groups get sorted, and collaborate? And can you talk a little bit about like the OS API stuff? And I think you're doing some other things since then with DAW developers.
Yeah, so one of the things is within the MIDI Association, we have different working groups, and there's quite a fair few of them who all sort of take on a particular topic, and all members can be part of any group, and we'll find that quite a fair few members are actually in many different groups. So we have, as Pete mentioned, one of the groups that we have is the OS API working group, which has got members from Apple, Microsoft, and Linux also, and also Google as well for Android, as well as other people who are working with these particular operating systems and cross platforms, really pushing and driving what is needed. So as opposed to trying to develop a lot of this stuff in a black box and someone going, well, here you go, there it is. It's actually giving us this really good ability to have a good sort of feedback loop and to try and make sure that there's some really good outcomes for that. So one of the things that we've also been doing with that, just on the OS API, is also having regular meetings in person, which actually means that we get a lot of stuff done and get to see some beautiful parts of the world, but also just in general, it really helps to make sure that, okay, you're in front of me, let's make sure that this works the way it is. Let's hook it up with a bunch of, prototype equipment, and have all these things. So that's one working group. There's other working groups for the different profiles that we were talking about. But we've also had other working groups come in for things like pitch and tuning. So, how does pitch and tuning actually work, or how should it work? We also talk about non-MIDI, non-music related stuff. We have a camera control profile that we're working on. And so you've got all these different groups that really help drive development. And so one of the big ones that we're working on at the moment is the DAW working group. So MIDI 2 at the moment, we've been releasing these specifications for the last 5 years, which is, it's one thing to release a specification. It's another thing to actually implement and put it out there. And so we actually sat down and went, okay, well, now that we've done these specifications, let's, start doing the implementations. And we realized with the DAWs that there's a lot more work and refinement that we can do in there. So one of the things is like, well, you've got your plugin in your DAW, and you've got your controller keyboard, which is all MIDI 2 enabled, and it does all a bunch of things. How do we make sure the plugin can provide information to that right through to that keyboard?
Right.
Or, we talk about, unifying and having standards. A lot of the DAW controls work off the Mackie standard, Mackie Huey standard. And what we're trying to say is, well, while that is a standard, it's not a well-documented standard that you can just download from anywhere. It's actually, quite a bit of work into it. How can we improve that to have it as have something similar as a MIDI Association / RMA defined standard that becomes a little bit more in use. So it's trying to make sure, again, going back to what does the musician need, and they need something that they don't have to think about. They don't want to know all this stuff. They don't want anything to do with all that. They want to plug it in and go, oh, okay, my DAW's found it, it's handled it, I focus on this track, my keyboard remaps itself to be exactly what should be there, or, to map the plugin that I'm looking at. I've got my little control that my DAW control thing that actually, manages my movement around the DAW, so I don't have to use a mouse and a keyboard. And again, I don't have to do any of that setup. I don't have to remember it between sessions. I can take this away from one session and put it into another session on a completely different computer. So all of those things that drive everyone nuts, you can actually, that's the area that's a big focus for us. And we realize that that's a lot of work. And so we're probably going to be spending a fair bit of time, at least, a good sort of 12 months or 2 years trying to perfect that, I think. Yeah.
And look, and just in regards to controller protocols, I mean, we've had, I can't remember what the DigiDesign one, it's not really used anymore, but there was an early DigiDesign one that was kind of specific to their controllers. And then there was Mackie Control, which has been around almost forever. And there was also Yukon, but Yukon is, it's a very specific and very dedicated protocol, originally created by Euphonics, and then Euphonics was acquired by Avid, and now it's part of Avid itself. But when you think about, let's just say Yukon, for example, there isn't a big uptake, apart from the actual Euphonics controllers. I keep saying Euphonics, but they're actually the Avid controllers. It didn't really make a fingerprint outside of that. So everyone was, the fallback was always Mackie Control. And, I've got to really think when that was first introduced. It would have to be would it be the 90s, guys, or maybe early 2000s for the original Mackie Control?
Yeah, it's been a while. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Look, the other thing too with all of those kinds of controls is now that we've got also the high resolution, if you mix the two, you no longer have stepping when you're going through controls.
Yeah. Yeah,
right?
of course.
And that's a big part of what we're looking at as well is, it's not just, okay, you're this kind of control, but let's make sure that everything is smooth.
Right.
Yeah. And look, that was the main draw for Yukon, was the actual resolution over Mackie Control, which is essentially over MIDI. Right. Yeah. So, but it never really took off outside of a very small circle there. So this is a completely different and new paradigm, so to speak.
Is the DigiDesign one what eventually became Logic Control, or were they completely separate? 'Cause I know
No.
Logic has its own Mackie type protocol.
Does it? I didn't even realize Logic had its own protocol.
I think Logic Control became Mackie Control.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, they're related.
Is
I
it?
can't remember which one came
Right.
first, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can't remember the Digi one, but it was only for their own dedicated controllers.
Right. And for people who aren't familiar with those, they do things like they use specific note-on messages to send that are defined as part of their sort of loose specification to say, enable this channel or something like that. Like it's really a completely sideways but necessary implementation.
Yeah, and if you screw up your MIDI routing, every time you hit play and stop and rewind, you're getting a ding, dang, ding, you're getting a MIDI note kind of firing off.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
So, Andrew, you're talking about the working groups, because I know I get a lot of questions from folks saying like, well, how can I be a member of the working groups? And those particular ones, you need to be a corporate MIDI association member, or are there other ways for people to participate?
Yeah, I would say that for the working groups inside the MIDI Association, you do need to be a corporate member. And look, I want to clarify why the MIDI Association does this, because I thought the same thing, before I was part of the MIDI Association, is why do they do things behind closed doors? And there's actually a very good reason for it. We spend a lot of time debating finer points of how something should work. It's not for the faint of heart at times, but certainly what it is that we don't want specifications going out that are half finished. We don't want specifications going out where someone goes, well, I implemented the draft version of what you put out, and that's all I'm going to do.
Right.
And someone who's got the final version finds that it doesn't work with someone who's got the draft version of a specification. So it's really important for us to make sure that when we get a specification out the door, that everyone's reviewed it. We have a whole process which goes through a 30-day review, and then we have a voting period, and then we have AAVIM, which is the Japanese companies who have their own sort of association. We work very, very closely with them. Everyone has to kind of agree and look over these things. So it's kind of like, many eyes trying to make sure that we get this right. And one of the things is, that's why it's sort of like we talk about specifications working on, but we won't talk about the specifics of what's in them.
Right.
For that very reason. So we do encourage people to get involved. So one of the things we do have is the MIDI.org website, which is I'm sure most people are aware of, but it's a big improvement from the old website from many years ago. But there's a forum on there, which we encourage people to get on and actually chat. In terms of the developer side of things, we will be, say proverbial we, this is still sort of in discussions, but the whole point is to increase the developer outreach program to kind of be a bit more in contact with people who, especially the open source folks who, don't have a lot of resources to join as an actual corporate member.
Yep.
I'm not sure what the size and shape of that's going to look like at this stage, but it's certainly something that we're well aware of and trying to improve. So that's one way of doing it. The other way to do it is to get onto the open source stuff that we have on MIDI 2.dev.
Yep.
Which is a collaboration between a few different MIDI Association members to try and we talk about the open source tools and libraries that we have available. That's where they're all on. And that's probably the best ways to get involved. But certainly in terms of if you're using a product and you want to talk about it, get onto the MIDI2.org, write up an article and promote what you're doing, because we always love to accept new articles on the MIDI2 website. That really kind of helps showcase what people are actually doing with it. I mean, we talk a lot about technology, but sometimes it's really good to hear what people are actually doing with it.
Mm-hmm. Going back to something you said a few minutes ago, so AME, AMEI, you said is the Japanese manufacturers. So just to clarify that, they're basically the MIDI Association, but for Japan, right? And so everything that we do, they also vote on it and have feedback and whatnot. So if you want to make sure that Roland and Yamaha and Korg and Kawai and those types of companies are on board, it really needs to go through them as well. But speaking of AME, we did a readiness event almost exactly a year ago in Japan, and props to Tori from Apple for organizing that to begin with, under the auspices of the OSAPI working group, where we had a whole bunch of people there plugging things in, trying stuff out. We had our early driver version for people to test out with hardware and stuff as well. And then we also did a follow-up to that in Redmond this past, was it November or was it October? I think it might have been November.
October.
Was it October? Yeah, it's all blurring together for me now. Where we had a lot of the same companies up there, and we were testing much more recent versions of things with all this different hardware. I can't name all the hardware that we had up there because some of it's not released yet, but that was incredibly helpful. And without the MIDI Association's involvement in that, it wouldn't have happened, because having Google online and having Apple and Microsoft in the same room on campus, and having all these other manufacturers together, you kind of need a tent to put that all under so that everybody's okay with that collaboration. And so the OSAPI working group was a really important part of that. And again, props to Andrew and also to Michael Lowe and other folks that have been running that since the beginning. So you talked earlier about the devices that are in market. Are you seeing like any trends, Andrew, with new devices coming out that support one of the flavors of MIDI 2.0?
Actually, this is kind of interesting because at the moment, I recently was at NAMM and doing the booth for the MIDI 2 products.
Yep.
And so one of the things is I sort of walked around, or not walked around, but before the NAMM, I sort of said, could I have everyone who's got a MIDI 2 product, give me a little posters that I can put on the wall. And I kind of expected about 10 posters, and I got about 21 of different MIDI 2 products. Right. And that didn't cover all of them because there was quite a fair few that we didn't know about. At the moment, it's interesting because MIDI 2 is there's so much to MIDI 2. We talk about the two parts, the MIDI CI part and the UMP part of MIDI 2. It's interesting to see which companies have actually gone for which parts. Mm-hmm. And it seems that some have gone for UMP, some have gone for MIDI CI. Some are also experimenting with things like, some of the other different transports that we're looking at as well. Interestingly enough, a lot of people were very interested in high resolution. So we actually had quite a fair few products coming out with the UMPs. So one of the big products is obviously the A88 Mark II from Roland. Right. It actually does do the MIDI 2 protocol. It sends the high resolution. But we also then starting to get the DAWs also going, well, we want to support the incoming UMP messages. So they're all supporting MIDI 2 and high resolution control coming in. So Logic is a good example with that. And then from there, we get products that are then starting to go, well, actually, we want to support that in terms of plugins. So we want, our sound modules to be able to actually, our plug-in sound modules to have all of these high resolution support as well. So that's been really kind of interesting. The MIDI CI side of things, you're finding exactly what we kind of expected. You're getting products that support a particular feature set. So example of this is piano, because we're working on this piano profile, where they go, well, this is the feature set that we want. We're a piano plugin, we're a piano standalone application. And that's exactly, we're going to support the piano profile. Then you're getting other things like, I talked about this with Korg before, where Korg have probably taken a very smart road in the sense that they've gone, look, everyone's still getting ready. We're still putting, as far as it's, we know that the DAW manufacturers are putting in a lot of this support, but it does take time. They've gone, look, what we're going to do is use MIDI CI for all of our internal products. Well, I shouldn't say all their internal products, but all their products within a certain range. So all of the ModWave and the OP6 and all the rest of it, Keystage, etc. And the reason that they do that is that when MIDI CI is a bit more in other products, it just integrates and it's just there.
Yep. That's very smart.
Yeah, so they're not waiting for everyone else in the industry to just come along. They're just using it instead of using their own proprietary format. And that helps them make sure that they're ready and future-proofed for other things that are going to come along. So it's really interesting because I think it's very diverse in terms of everyone's idea of what they want to support at this point in time. And the other thing too is everyone's kind of just dipping their toe. They're all going to be doing it. This is the one thing I will say is everyone I've spoken to is like, oh yes, it's part of our development cycle. We know we've got it. We know we're on board. We see all the benefits. We're doing that, but they're starting out. And so, for example, the Complete Control 3 from Native Instruments, it has a UMP mode. So it has a normal MIDI 1 mode, sends normal MIDI byte stream over USB, but it has a MIDI 2 mode. The MIDI 2 mode at the moment only sends, when it sends in UMP, it only sends MIDI 1 protocol. So we've talked about this before. In terms of UMP, you can send both the existing MIDI 1 kind of messages, but you can also send the higher resolution MIDI 2 messages.
Yep.
So they did that initially as just a, look, we get it in the door, we know that the drivers work, we know that, when we work with the various OSs, everything's going to work. They kind of doing that to kind of figure out, I think my understanding is to kind of figure out customer support and what they need to do and all those kinds of things. But they will upgrade that machine to support MIDI 2 protocol. We got that as a yes, they will do it at NAMM. And I think what we're also finding is that other people that aren't part of the MIDI Association are doing that. So interestingly enough, one of the things that I wasn't aware of is a lot of the iOS apps, the MIDI apps on iOS, and there's a heap of them. A lot of them are all internally using UMP now. And the reason they're doing that, apparently, is because there was a buggy release of Core MIDI in one particular version of iOS, and so they all had to flick over to using UMP. So there's a whole bunch of those kinds of apps that are now using UMP, and users aren't even aware of it. So it's only kind of a couple of steps before they can start saying, well, we're using UMP, we can use the high resolution of that, and so you'll have a whole bunch of applications that have the potential to use high resolution. So I think people aren't realizing that all of this stuff is all happening in the background already.
Right.
And we've got various hardware as well, like the MBODME, for example. Even though it's all MIDI 1 on the outside, internally, at least for the first version, and I'm assuming for the second version, it's all UMP internally. They just output it as MIDI 1 byte stream when they, for the connections. So the whole point of that is I expect the NAMM 9 months prior, I had a couple of demos. And firmwares that were prototype firmwares, and then 9 months later we have a sort of explosion, a mini explosion, not a very large explosion, but a mini explosion of products and firmware that's out in the public. And this is not even talking about the stuff that's not available. We're talking about the things that are actually available to people today. And it's quite a good explosion, and I think that's going to get bigger and bigger. And I think, Nick, I worry about what the stand's going to look like next NAMM, because I get the feeling I'm going to be sitting there going, okay, we're going to have to, think about how we display all the MIDI 2 products, because there's a lot more this time.
Yeah. I probably have 6 or 7 MIDI 2.0 products here with me, and a couple of them are not released yet in that form, but they are full and impressive MIDI 2.0 implementations. And then at NAMM, I didn't even know about this. Remember, you and I were over there trying to find the Waldorf folks, but Waldorf released firmware for their Iridium, which I happen to have an Iridium here, that does full UMP. So it was nice to see companies with existing products, which is what most of these are, with existing products, that they've been willing to update the firmware to provide like new high resolution values and whatnot.
Well, look, I think the good thing and from just a layman sitting back and listening in here, is that the transition is happening almost seamlessly in the background, that we don't have to be, we as musicians don't have to be aware of the technical aspect of it. It's just
Right.
the transition is just going to be happening in the background, and then as more and more instruments and software become capable, you don't have to do anything. It's just there, and you just transition into the higher resolution aspect of it. So I think that's a good thing,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was going to say one other extra thing with that is that a big part of that has been the operating systems. In terms of Windows has probably got the biggest change, but in terms of the other operating systems, they're, very much it's happened in the background and most people wouldn't even notice. That's a positive. I mean, Apple's done a lot of work in Core MIDI. It works the same way for MIDI 1 as it did before. When you have a MIDI 2 device, it still works the same way for your MIDI 1 applications. And I know I'm going to let Pete talk about how Windows does that, but also is the same way for Linux. It's like, okay, I got a MIDI 1 device, it works exactly the same way, and then when I got a MIDI 2 device, I can still use it with my MIDI 1 applications. And it's great. And then when I want to use the MIDI 2 features of it, I can use the MIDI 2 features of it. Again, it's subtle in the sense that a lot of people have probably got MIDI 2 support and they're not even aware of it.
Yeah, and that's how you know it's successful. Like if you can sort of slide this in underneath and musicians don't have to worry about it, just like Vin's saying, then that's a success, right? At the NAMM show, we had a prototype build of Steinberg Cubase as well as a prototype build of Bremer's multi-track studio, both of which have been updated to use the new Windows API and use UMP natively. And with Cubase, like it was pretty seamless. Like when you look in there, you could see that the values that were being captured had a decimal point now, right? And that was really the only kind of giveaway that you weren't stuck with 127 velocity steps anymore, right? Which I thought was super helpful. So Vin, I think we can talk a bit about the Windows implementation now, since I know you and I have also had a lot of conversations about that. But this is where I like to pull in Gary. Gary's been working on the audio team for quite a long time and has had to spelunk some of these older APIs and code that says copyright 1990 something up in the up in the code headers and stuff like that. But like Andrew alluded to, the Windows has a lot of changes because we haven't done much of anything with MIDI and Windows in a very long time. Like there's kind of an ocean of things that people wanted to see. So we talked early on, Gary and I, about creating something kind of brand new and doing it quote unquote the right way. So Gary, can you kind of fill us in on the old WinMM APIs and sort of at a technical level how some of that worked and kind of why we had to create something new on top of that?
Yeah, so the old WinMM API. So it was written probably while I was in elementary school. So it was good. It's good for its day. So, and it's gone through two different driver architectures. So there's the original WinMM driver that uses essentially some kind of Windows messages, right, to talk to this driver. And then at some point later on, we brought in they brought in the USB audio driver or USB MIDI driver, and then it started doing kernel streaming. And so that a wrapper was made around kernel streaming that makes it look like a WinMM driver. And so then it talks to the kernel streaming driver. But so it all runs in proc inside the user modes process. And it talks directly to the driver. And so when you're sending a Windows a MIDI message, you're putting together your byte stream, you're making the call into the driver, you're waiting for that call into the driver to complete before you can do another message. And so the driver has to do whatever processing it wants to do for that message. And so I suspect that's where a lot of the complaints about jitter and latencies and stuff end up coming in, is because the processes, in order to make this work and send messages from your process, you're going to end up really putting in a buffer, right? You're going to have to put your message into a buffer, and you have to have a worker thread that's taking messages out of that buffer, sending it down to the driver. And then, when it gets down into kernel mode, like our USB audio driver, it doesn't send the message right then and there. it puts it inside of another buffer, which then waits for the USB window to open to send the message across USB. And so lots of copies from buffers, copying of the buffers, and it didn't really, there was a lot of stuff that was just sequential.
Yep.
And so that's the WinMM API. The WinRT API, that was created not that long ago, but it was created for store applications. So a lot of the issues there were around security.
Right.
And so what it has to do is it takes these messages from the store application, and then it does a remote procedure call, an RPC, into a runtime broker service. And then that runtime broker service had its own implementation of talking to kernel streaming drivers. It didn't build on the WinMM stuff. It was a completely parallel implementation with its own set of bugs.
Right.
And it didn't function identically the same as the old WinMM API. So it had this RPC call, and then it had to serialize these calls into the driver. And of course, WinMM API and WinRT API couldn't use the same driver at the same time because you can only have one pin instances on these drivers at once. And then also, there was a choice at that time to have Bluetooth MIDI only in the WinRT API.
Right. Right.
And so, yeah.
It's on the going back to the WinMM side for a second there. So just so folks know, that's pretty much what every DAW uses today. Most non-store applications that are doing MIDI stuff are using WinMM. And the architecture you explained, it also explains why if you want to do anything new like RTP MIDI or add Bluetooth MIDI to that or do any sort of virtual MIDI, somebody's got to go write a driver for it at that point.
Well, and not just a driver, it realistically ends up being a kernel streaming driver, which means it's a kernel mode driver.
Right.
So if you want to do Bluetooth MIDI with the WinMM API, you're talking making a call into a kernel mode driver, which then needs to call into the Bluetooth user mode surfaces in order to send the data over Bluetooth.
Yeah. And so it just ended up not being extensible. And also at the same time, I think you can all hear the undertone there that we couldn't do multi-client because that relied on each driver implementation handling that specifically, which some did, right? So it just wasn't very extensible. And I like to have that information out there because people are like, oh, why the hell are you creating yet another API to do this? And I think it's important for folks to know that updating the old APIs was just not sustainable, right?
Yeah. So the old WinMM API, it was architected around byte stream.
Yeah.
And so it's not going to send UMPs across. And so for every block of byte stream data, you're making a call down to the driver waiting for stuff to complete. It's a product of its day.
Right. Yeah.
And so looking at this and knowing how like the Windows audio stack works and how much better architectures that are available nowadays. So I've addressed a lot of these issues using cross-process buffers. So it's a block of memory that's allocated and shared between either the MIDI process and the service, or the service and the driver. And so when you want to send a MIDI message, you're not calling down all the way into the driver and waiting for stuff. You're copying that MIDI message into this cross-process buffer and just setting an event. And then a worker thread on the other side wakes up from that event and does its processing. And so there's no need to copy the data from user mode to kernel mode and then have kernel mode copy that data into another buffer and then have that, and so on. It's you copy the data into the cross-process buffer, you set the event, and the other side wakes up when it can process it. Like if in the case of USB, it can wake up at that USB window, see if there's messages to send them.
Yeah. And as part of this, you implemented a window service in the middle, like you had for audio, that has I forget what you called it, a graph or a chain of message processing through it.
Yeah. So in the audio land, you'll see this audio.dg.exe, and that's our audio device graph process. And that's where all the processes in the system that are talking to the audio driver to play audio or record audio, it goes to that process, and that process then sends it or receives it from the driver. So something similar, but MIDI has different requirements, is this new concept of a MIDI service. The MIDI service has MIDI pipes for each of the MIDI clients, and then it takes those pipes and either mixes them together or splits the data out and duplicates it so that multiple clients can talk to the same MIDI endpoint at the same time. So if you have two clients that are wanting to send MIDI messages out at the same time to the same MIDI endpoint, they can both open their cross-process queue. They can send messages to their cross-process queue. The service wakes up when those messages come in, mixes them together, sends them to the cross-process queue for the driver, and then the driver sends it out to the peripheral.
Nice. Yeah. And one thing that I appreciated about that design is that the architecture was such that when we wanted to create new types of transports like Bluetooth or app-to-app MIDI or things like that, they become these plugins in the service as opposed to somebody having to write a kernel streaming driver.
Yeah. So early on, I wanted to be able to handle that. And so this is actually something that the audio stack doesn't really do today, is this concept of an abstraction layer. So the service knows how to talk to an abstraction layer for an endpoint. And that abstraction layer can be Bluetooth, it could be network, it can be kernel streaming, infrared in the future, who knows? And so that abstraction layer is implemented inside of the surface as a user mode process. So there's no rule that you have to jump to kernel mode. So for Bluetooth, the Bluetooth message, the MIDI messages are going to come into the service. The service is going to take those messages, and the Bluetooth abstraction layer can just send them over to the Bluetooth stack without going down to the kernel mode at all.
Yeah. So that the end result of this is because we have like this new architecture that's faster and more efficient for transferring between the client and between the devices and stuff. And we have these abstractions or transports in the middle that we can plug in. It makes it a lot easier for us to add new features to the MIDI services over time. Like when we ship 1.0, it's going to have the kernel streaming stuff that talks to our new combined USB MIDI 2.0 and 1.0 driver, as well as the kind of the classic drivers that are kernel streaming drivers. But it also ships with a loopback MIDI setup, app-to-app MIDI, and then we're working on things like Bluetooth and network and a bunch of other stuff that's in there as well.
Yeah, and those loopback and stuff, they're just another abstraction.
Yep.
Just like Bluetooth MIDI will be and like kernel streaming MIDI is.
So my hope is that folks like Andrew in the future, when they want to prototype a new protocol, they know that they can do that on Windows just by writing this relatively simple COM component that plugs into the service. And then your code loads up that COM component, and it can talk to it just like any other MIDI device. The other thing you did, Gary, is, and I know you're working on this right now, and we'll come back around and talk about the project itself in a second. But when I mentioned that this is a brand new API, people think, oh crap, none of my existing applications are going to work. But you've been working on the solution to that to kind of remap the old API stuff into the new API to get some of the benefits. Like, can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I had mentioned earlier that for WinMM, there was a wrapper that was written around kernel streaming as a WinMM driver. So today, when you use the Win32 WinMM MIDI stuff, you call into that WinMM MIDI, which then calls into this driver that's not really a driver, it's running in user mode, which then calls into the kernel streaming driver, which then goes out. And so that gives us a nice clean place to actually cut ties to the old API, the old implementation. And now when you call WinMM MIDI, it's going to call into this user mode, not really driver thing that was already there, so we can keep backwards compatibility and as much stability as possible. But then that component, rather than talking to the kernel streaming driver, can now start talking to the MIDI service. And so it can take these byte stream messages from these legacy applications, package them up, send them over to the MIDI service. And from the application's perspective, the data is just flowing out, and it doesn't know that there's now this MIDI service in there handling this. But it also enables multi-client support with all of those applications, because now each client can just talk to their pipe on the service, and the service will take care of mixing them together, and it'll all just work in theory.
Nice. You know how it is, Vin. It's in theory, right? But we've been testing a lot of stuff here, though, and what we really like, and I'll talk about this in a second because it's kind of key to this, is we've had all the manufacturers testing stuff too. Like Roland and Yamaha and some others have been prolific in helping file bugs with us on this, which shows that they're testing all these things out. But one of the other things that, Gary, that enables you to do that is you also wrote kind of the equivalent of these of the abstractions for like endpoints. You wrote transformations using Andrew's conversion library, right? So how does that come into play?
Yeah. So for the abstraction, the abstractions for the endpoints, they have a MIDI in, MIDI out, and then you're sending the data or getting from it. For a transform, you're taking this block of MIDI data, sending it in, and then getting it out at the other end with changes. This is in many ways similar to, for the audio stack, are audio processing objects, APOs. And so building upon that same concept in MIDI, we can create these transform abstractions. And the transform abstractions can be inserted anywhere in the pipeline. It can come like per client abstraction or transform. So the data can come in from the client and get a transform applied. And then two different clients on the same endpoint would have different transforms applied. Or it can be applied at the other end of the pipeline, like right before it goes out to the device. So then every client that's talking to that device gets that transform. So initial transforms to create, we've created some transforms for doing MIDI 1, MIDI 2 to MIDI 2, and MIDI 2 to MIDI 1. And so, of course, I have no interest in implementing much of that myself. So yeah, I built on Andrew's library. And so we got this transform com component, which then uses Andrew's AM library to just do these transforms. So these MIDI 1 clients can talk to the new endpoint, the new MIDI 2 devices, new MIDI 2 endpoints, or UMP clients can talk to MIDI 1 devices.
Right. And so that gives us the ability to kind of connect any type of device up to the service. The API, like the new API has one unified way of presenting that. But then because of these, we can still service the old APIs with the formats that they're expecting. So it's actually, it's pretty clever. And I've sort of bastardized your implementation a little bit and shoved in things like message scheduling as one of those transforms that kind of holds on to a queue of messages and sends them out via timestamps and stuff like that. So it's actually quite a flexible design for doing those things. And we know that customers have been asking us for a while to do other stuff like remapping controls and do like old MIDI mapper type stuff. And although those won't necessarily be out in version 1, that architecture you have there gives us the ability to do that. You mentioned using Andrew's library, and once again, Andrew, thank you. It's probably a good time now to talk about this being open source, right? So this project, let me take a little bit of a step back for the Windows MIDI Service Project. This kind of started way back when some folks in AAVIM, the Japanese MIDI Manufacturing Association, said, "Hey, when are you guys going to get to MIDI 2.0?" And we're like, yeah, it's not on our plate this year. We could evaluate it for the following year, et cetera, but we weren't sure when to get to it yet because it required a lot of domain expertise and other things there that we just didn't have the resources for at the time or necessarily the knowledge, right? So then eventually AAVIM came back and said, hey, what about if we do the driver development for you all? So they would do the MIDI 1.0 / MIDI 2.0 combined USB driver for this, which would unblock a huge amount of work that we had to do. And they said simply, hey, we'll do this if you all do the API and stuff at the same time. And that was really kind of the genesis of the project. And my suggestion to them, which they agreed to later, was if we just do it all as open source, then they're just contributing to the repo. It's not like they've necessarily gifted something to Microsoft. It's kind of the larger open source implementation that anybody can learn from and anybody can use. And so now we have a GitHub repo that has pretty much all of the code that we develop for the service, as well as the API and the abstraction layers Gary talked about, but also the USB MIDI driver, all as part of that, which I think, that's kind of new for us, especially in Windows, where, we don't tend to do a whole lot of stuff in the open. And there are historically good reasons for that. Like Gary, when there are changes made to stuff in the repo, like you have to be able to pull that in and do your own compilation and change things around internally. Like at whatever level of detail you're comfortable sharing, can you talk about what that process is a bit?
Sure. So the Windows internal build system is not Visual Studio projects. We have our own build system that's command line build. And so one thing that this is involving is I'm maintaining two different build systems for all of this code.
Yep.
So we have a Windows internal build system for building all the service and all these abstraction layers and the driver. And then we also have Visual Studio projects with installers for doing it. So there's some challenges there. The Windows internal build system also has a different mechanism for packaging stuff and including it in the operating system, adding all of the correct registry keys and the binaries and getting those ingested into the OS build so that when you run your installer and install Windows, it's there. And so I got to maintain all of that on top of all the open source code. And then, of course, we're maintaining 2 copies of the code, unfortunately. So I'm taking code that Pete writes for the API, and I have to merge it back into the Windows OS build. Or when we do work on the service and add features to the service, then I'm merging it back to the public build. So there's a lot of code moving back and forth. Quite a bit of extra overhead. And then we also use the VCX project stuff, which is on GitHub for ingesting open source components. So I'll be using that to ingest Andrew's library into the Windows OS build.
Yep.
So we can not even have to keep a copy of his code there. We're just going to be ingesting a package of his code regularly.
And I think people might ask you well, why do you have to ingest it into Windows at all? There are open source projects that just ship libraries, but there's signing and other stuff that comes into play there.
Right. So when the OS builds, it signs this code to make sure to say that, yes, this code is trusted. It comes from Microsoft. There's also rules on a third party can't create a class driver, right? You can't go out and create your own USB class driver and ship it on Windows. You can create a driver that targets specific hardware, but you can't create a driver that targets all hardware. And so in order for the USB MIDI 2 driver to be a class driver, to be usable for any USB MIDI 2 peripheral that you plug in, it has to be ingested through the Windows build system and put into the Windows install.
Yep. And I also learned some interesting things there. For example, on the WinRT type system, there's, to install that, it really needs to be shipping as part of Windows because there's this whole trusted installer process and other stuff that's part of that.
Right. So what we've ended up learning is outside of Windows, you can create yourself a WinRT API and use it within your code. But you can't create a new WinRT Windows API for use by everyone to be installed on Windows. It has to be ingested by clients specifically looking for your library. And so, yes, in order to do a WinRT API for Windows, it has to go through the Windows build system.
Yep. So it's good for folks out there to understand why more Windows projects don't necessarily go through this, but there is a fair bit of overhead, like you said, for all that rectification. And then doing things like when we want to release a new version of the driver for people to test, it needs to go through our internal signing process. If you don't want to go and reboot your PC and set it to support test signing, which a lot of companies won't allow you to do to your PCs because you're turning off secure boot and a bunch of other stuff. So there are things that are different with an operating system versus, say, like .NET or some other things that sit on top of the operating system and don't have to integrate quite as deeply.
Yeah, there's some challenges. And then there's also challenges around code quality and code.
Hey, we're not going to talk about my shitty code quality, I hope here.
So just something that people are aware of. So you'll see if you look at our MIDI 2 source code, you're going to see stuff where like the API parameters are tagged with in and out and stuff like that. So that's the source annotation language. And so there's tools, they're even available in Visual Studio for doing code analysis that uses those annotations to identify like, oh, this function says it's going to have an output parameter and write some data, but you didn't actually write any data. And so those analysis tools flag stuff like that. And so we have to, by policy, put those tags in, make them accurate, and maintain them, and maintain that code quality.
Yeah, I ran into that early on because you're like, oh, you need to use Sal on all your code. And I was like, what the hell is Sal? I had never heard of it before that point. And that was all that annotation stuff. And it even goes further than that. There's the FXCOP/RTCOP based things to make sure your APIs have names that fit with standards. Like it kept yelling at me to abbreviate the word information to info, for example. Otherwise, it was going to fail that test. And there are a bunch of other little things like that, like about the types that you return and everything. So there are a lot of internal checks that we do that aren't necessarily the same as the kind of public tools do as well.
Yeah, if you're writing your own WinRT API and it's not part of the operating system, you can write it however you want. But as part of when it goes into the Windows operating system, there's policies to try to make sure like, oh, it's consistent with the rest of our API surface. Yep. So it's not like a mishmash. And so, yes, we got those review policies with like FXCOP to make sure that the naming conventions and the whether or not it's asynchronous or stuff like that matches overall guidelines for the operating system. And then also, as Pete's well aware now, we also have to push the API through an API review process and have people within the upper levels of the operating system that review all the APIs that go in say, yes, you can add this to the operating system.
Yeah, I have that document in progress. It's ridiculously long, but it's actually... Like MIDI sounds simple, but this API is quite large for all the things that we're trying to do here and trying to address and support MIDI 1.0 and 2.0 at the same time, which also is why it's taking longer than, say, Apple required. Even though technically, I was looking back, we only started the work here really less than a year ago, roughly, if I look back at the timeline. So it hasn't taken forever, but it's still, it's still taken a bit to do. The other, so I think we covered most of the API stuff there, and now it's time for all the folks who aren't developers in the audience to wake back up. Because, Vin, are you?
Yeah, I'm still here, mate. Hey, let's just one real quick thing.
Yeah,
it was in the notes, and you should make a point of this, that the MIDI 2 API is going to be also included in Windows 10.
Oh, right, yeah.
That's an important one, Pete. Not, I know that people were asking to go back even further, which we thought was hilarious, but, it is going back to Windows 10.
Yeah, the person asking me to support Windows 7, I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen, unfortunately. I know we hold on to things, but yeah. Right, so the intent here, we only know once we finally ship, right? But our intent and the way all our design has been working and the way the USB stack changes that Egidio on the team put together have been intended to work is Windows 11 plus the latest supported Windows 10.
Which would be the last build, which was 22H2.
Yep.
Am I right?
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
We can't ask people to service anything that's out of service. So, and because even though this is an open source project and we can do certain other things through this, there are USB stack changes that had to happen, as well as a new kind of driver definition and stuff that had to happen in order to support the new UMP-based driver, and so we have to put a cap on how far back we can go with that. But you're right, yeah. We know a lot of people are still on Windows 10. I would love them to move to Windows 11, but we're trying to make sure that it works on 10 as well.
Well, you just have to entice them, Pete. And this is not a conversation we're going to have here. But I've given I've given you a few clues of how you might be able to entice a few across.
I'm totally into the carrot versus the stick, so I'm 100% with you on that.
You might need to kind of hang a gold ring on that carrot with some of these people.
Stop.
Okay.
So mentioning that there's a new driver architecture, that is actually a good point and something maybe worth calling out. So the original MIDI driver was called WDM, the Windows driver model, the original kernel streaming. And then there's a port class based MIDI driver. So this new USB MIDI driver that we're sharing is based on ACX, the audio class extension, which is a new audio driver architecture that our team is working on for use for audio as well. So yeah, there's some quite a bit of new things there.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's probably one of the main reasons why it's never going to go back to Windows 7, amongst other things.
Yeah, when ACX is not going back to Windows 7.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Andrew, you were saying something?
Yeah, I was going to say, Pete, one of the things you've mentioned in the past is the fact that we may not need to have all these different third-party drivers being installed.
Yeah. It was actually really interesting for me to learn that. Like most companies I talk to, especially on the audio side, say, can you please provide inbox drivers? We don't want to write our own drivers. But then when you talk to like AAVIM folks, they're all, oh, we love writing our own drivers. We want to write drivers. And I was like, can we not? So we're trying to get folks to not write custom drivers for anything going forward. And if they do, we're hoping that instead of doing something fully custom, since our USB MIDI driver is in the repo, maybe they just do a pull request to that for whatever change it is that they need. And if it's appropriate, we either roll it into that driver or we fork that and they do provide their own driver, but it's coming from the same kind of base as the rest of the stuff. It's not a from scratch implementation. And then from that, like you said, the other part that helps people not write drivers is this, the abstractions that Gary talked about, where there's no reason Bluetooth MIDI 1.0 or Network MIDI 2.0, which is a spec in development right now, need to be kernel mode drivers. Like they can be user mode just fine. And so having them fully implemented as plugins in the service gets people, like kernel driver development is actually really hard. Like you end up having to do, not all the same tools are available to you. Even the APIs that you have available to you are different. Even the standard library is different when you're working in the kernel mode stuff versus user mode stuff. So getting people out from that, and also cutting down the risk, because kernel mode drivers are how you get green screens and blue screens on the PC. Like getting people out of developing those drivers is a big goal of this.
Yeah, of course.
Hey, so I think we've talked a bunch here. I think the last part about the Windows implementation I'd like to talk about is kind of tools here. Unless, Gary, was there anything else you wanted to talk about on the service? Or
no, I think we covered it.
Okay. So thank you for all that. There are two tools that we're also going to deliver kind of out of band with this, where like the API and all that stuff needs to be delivered with Windows, as well as there's a simple command line tool that will deliver with Windows as well that companies can use to get a dump of the state of the system, so that if you're on a support call with somebody, they can just say, hey, type this in and give me the output, or they can provide a button in their application and they actually capture the output for that. So that's one application. We do ship inbox, but it's super simple. The other stuff that we are delivering is there's a console app kind of for power users that lets you automate a lot of MIDI stuff. So you can, from the command line, say MIDI, send a message to this device and send this information to it. And in that way, like right now, it's really good for testing, for performance, as well as just testing functionality. But If you need to script something in the future where you have a standard setup that you use and you want to make sure that all the devices have the same patches loaded and all that, you can create a simple little command file that holds all those steps and just run it before your performance, and it can get all those devices synchronized and in place. And you can also use it to dump sysx and all that kind of stuff. And that's more for power users. The second piece is a MIDI settings application, where we didn't talk about this at all yet, but one of the big parts of the service is a lot of things are configurable. So we have these JSON files that we use for capturing the state of your current configuration on your machine. And it's just a text file, so you can like copy it from like your studio PC to your performance PC or whatever, and say that, hey, this is the current profile I want loaded. And that profile can do things like rename devices, create standard loopback endpoints in advance, add description information for different devices, because we actually capture some additional metadata for devices, et cetera, so that when you move these things around or when you use these from other applications, like all of that information is available to every application that goes to use it. So we capture several different names. We know naming has always been a problem, but the user can always override that with their own name if they want to be able to rename these endpoints. And same thing with description and other metadata. And that's also how we'll end up doing some of the things I'd mentioned before, like having hard-coded or user-supplied profiles for other devices that don't support it. Now, that's not in place yet, but the infrastructure for those types of things is getting in place. And this, the MIDI settings app will let you do all the types of things that you would normally have to do with MIDI. There's actually some videos that I think I showed that at the NAMM show. I have to go back and look. I know I showed the prototype of Cubase and Bremer's multi-track studio, and I think I also showed the command line tool. I don't remember if I showed the MIDI settings application or not at that time, but we'll have releases of that soon as well.
Very cool.
So that's it for us on the Windows side, Vin. I think we're good there.
Right. So would it be good to bring Andrew back just to talk about some more planned articles from the MIDI Association? You there, Andrew?
I am still here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the MIDI Association has been doing a lot more articles on MIDI.org about, how to use MIDI 2, what it all means, what it means for the musician as well as what it means for developers. We've got more articles. So we did a range of articles about how to do USB MIDI 2, which has actually had a really good response because it's a fairly much in the weeds kind of topic. We have a third part of that coming out hopefully very soon. We also have another article which is kind of like Pete mentioned names, and if there's something that people like doing, it's like having another place for another name. And so, everywhere, it's a bit like, oh, we should put a name here. And it's like, don't we have three others? Anyway, the thing about that is there's also an article going up which kind of says, look, when you've got this field, use this name and use the same name here, here, and here, because they're all read at different levels by different parts of applications and operating systems. So let's try and have it fairly consistent. So, to get the best sort of outcome. So there's that kind of article coming out. We will be doing more articles about MIDI CI, I believe, in terms of, what's the best way we can kind of get, what's the best bang for buck if you want to try and set up something for your device that actually helps, the users, what's been integrated the most ways. So we're going to have a look at that, and also a lot of articles about, where does this actually become, where can you use it? Where can this become the most useful? But also, what can you do for your own applications? I mean, we've been talking in the background with a few manufacturers about doing a GUI side of property exchange. And the whole point of that is that, you plug in your device and it gives you a whole interface of that device. So there's a few people who are sort of interested in that kind of topics as well, and how that could be achieved. But also just a lot of stuff about the best way to actually use it. So the best way to handle, as we talk about things like pitch and tuning, but also, the best way to handle channels and that kind of thing. So there's going to be a lot more articles over the next little while, and we will continue to do a lot more sort of prototyping and development.
Very cool. So have we covered everything, Pete, or is there anything else that you think that we should move on to?
I'll give just a quick shout out if folks want to learn more about the stuff that Microsoft is doing. And Andrew, I'm going to ask you the same question for General MIDI Association here in a second. But if they want to learn more about the stuff that Microsoft is doing, they can join us on our Discord server, where actually we've been working with a lot of developers and stuff on there, but some folks that have come in and joined just out of interest as a MIDI user. And probably the easiest way to get to those is if you go to aka.ms/MIDI, that'll bring you to our documentation page, which also has the Discord server and the repo and everything linked there on top. So that's really my old call out for that. Happy to get feedback. We don't have stuff for end user testing yet, so I don't encourage any musicians to come out and try the stuff. It's really for developers at this point. But as soon as we have it in box later this year, then everybody will be able to use it.
Now, I did ask this question in the previous podcast, and I'm going to ask it again. So the timeline, originally they were saying, Windows 12. Well, there is no Windows 12. So
Right.
We kind of put a stamp on that one. So it would have to be 23, sorry, where are we? 20, God, I don't even know what year it is. 24H2 would probably be the earliest rollout for this.
Well, I don't want to get into details here, but we're looking at different ways of shipping this in Windows, and it doesn't necessarily have to align with a specific release.
So this can actually be injected. Well, is injected
Maybe,
the correct word, but with a patch.
Yeah, we've so that's what we're investigating. I don't want to promise to anybody here yet. My organization leadership has changed 3 times in the past 6 months, and each time that happens, they have kind of a different focus. So we'll see what happens there in terms of being able to ship that.
Right. Now, just real quickly, because I missed it in Andrew's introduction, was that he's the chair of which section of the MIDI Association? You're a chair of a part of the MIDI Association, Andrew. Can you just give us that again? Because you did mention it, but I want to kind of get it out there and make it a little bit more clear.
Yeah, so I'm the chair of the Developer Support Working Group.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll make sure that I actually have that in the written description. But I kind of missed that in your early introduction. I do apologise, but we go. We got it in.
So, Andrew, so the background to what I was saying earlier, where should people go to learn more about MIDI 2.0 or just MIDI in general?
Right. So obviously the best location is MIDI.org. There's so many articles on there. There's enough reading to not quite War and Peace, but it's up there, right? If you do have a look at that, there's lots of different articles for, as I said, both the musician and the developer. If you're a developer, I would suggest heading across to MIDI2.dev, and that gives links to the GitHub repository, which has got all of the different projects that we were talking about, including the one of the things I didn't mention earlier was the Armanote project, which is a protozoa, which is a development board for MIDI 2 development as well. That's available. So I would go and have a look at all of that. Have a look at the code. It's all there. And people are welcome to sort of reach out through the MIDI.org website and the forums if they are looking for help or support. And we can always try and get in contact with them.
Nice, thanks.
Right. Oh, that almost feels like a full stop. Look, guys, I think we should put a pin in that for now, because we're definitely going to have plenty to talk about, I suspect, in the next 12 months as this development accelerates. So let's leave it at that for now. I thank all of you guys for your time and energy today. There's a stack of info. I'm still trying to wrap my head around half of it, but I'll and have a good listen as I'm actually editing this up and get a good grounding for what is actually incoming. And I'm sure that there's going to be plenty of people listening in, especially from that developer area, that are going to pull a stack of information from this show. So it's all great. So again, thank you very much, guys. I think with that, on to the next.